Since April 2019, there were two of the media regulators who picked up on the Level Up campaign's new guidelines, which talked about how you would do best practice in terms of reporting domestic violence deaths in the UK. What's noticeable is that that was April 2019. We're now in November 2020. And sadly, we're seeing almost on a weekly basis that a lot of the best practice that was endorsed by those regulators doesn't seem to be in place. So I'm really delighted to be having a conversation with Janey Starling, who was behind and in fact was very much the powerhouse behind those new guidelines. She was the Level Up campaign director at the time, and Megha Mohan, who is the BBC's gender and identity correspondent for BBC World Service. Janey, if I can start with you first of all, thinking about new journalists coming into the profession, can we be clear, first of all, what are the headlines that Level Up was really wanting to stop? Give us an idea of what it is that's wrong in the first place.
Okay, so let me pull it back to fatal domestic abuse in the UK just to give some context, because I think journalists recognise that suicide is a specialist subject that we need to be careful about, and I would argue the same for fatal domestic abuse. So we live in a country where 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner. Now, under lockdown, that's risen to 3 to 5 women a week. That's absolutely terrifying. And what's even scarier, given that this is now a standing news item because it happens so often, is that so many journalists really just don't understand the gravity to the extent of their reporting. So what we're looking at here is journalists perpetuating myths that these murders are crimes of passion. They're not, they're crimes of control. There's so much evidence that goes to show that fatal domestic abuse is planned, is motivated by control. 49% of women are murdered within a month of leaving an abusive partner. Separation is a really key driving factor. And so, it's just very, very sad in a country where everybody should be doing everything they can to try and reduce the number of women who are being killed by their partners. Journalists are just sensationalizing, they're speculating, they're really intruding on the editor's code. I've just completed some research with victims' families. I spoke to 15 different victims' families, and the majority of them had been doorstepped, had family members trace down elderly members of the family and were repeatedly calling them. There is clear intrusion into grief and shock when it comes to fatal domestic abuse. And what's really, really sad about that is that families don't know their rights, and they don't know how to push back against it. And there's an element of real dismissal of the trauma and grief that a family is going through. And so the Level Up guidelines were created as a tool for journalists just to say, listen, you're probably not an expert in fatal domestic abuse, but you do live in a country where you hold huge responsibility on getting it right. And if you get it right, we could actually stop more women dying.
I mean, that's first of all, that's a very succinct, and I'm not surprised. This is something you're very passionate about and you've been working on for a long time. Why is it that it's so persistent then? I mean, you argue extremely, cogently about it. It makes absolute sense. I don't know, and I've been teaching journalism for a long time. The students who come through my hands, not one of them would be wanting to add pain, want to be perpetuating myths. So why is it that somehow these headlines that tend to sensationalize, tend to omit the woman's name, the person who's actually been murdered, that they seem to disappear? Why is it that seems to keep on being perpetuated? Because unless we're suggesting that the profession is somehow fatally flawed, which I think none of us is suggesting.
No, not at all. And I think, what I love and admire about journalists is their commitment to accuracy and truth. I think a strong, independent press is absolutely central to democracy. And I think journalists do a really difficult job. And unfortunately, what happens in the case of fatal domestic abuse reporting is they're not necessarily reporting the truth, because I think, beyond journalism, all of us have quite a grim fascination with murder and death. And that's why true crime series are so popular. And there is an emotional distancing that goes on with that, because we're all so curious as to how someone could commit such a terrible, terrible thing against another person. When it comes to fatal domestic abuse, I think there's some of this almost like very disconnected, emotionally, unempathetic true crime nature to actual news reporting, when what we need to strive to be doing is actually recognise that fatal domestic abuse doesn't come out of the blue. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It needs to be contextualized within the broader context and character of relationship, which will almost always be controlling, abusive, potentially physically violent before, and there will almost always have been a separation or a trigger that forces a confrontation of loss of control for the perpetrator, which then they resolve by killing the victim. And so I think what's really, really important for journalists to remember is that the families and the children of that woman who has been murdered, who's lost her life in the most cruel and traumatic way, already traumatized, and they will see your news reports as a public memorial of their mother. And I think I've spoken to plenty of victims' families who are they can't even recount the headlines because it's so painful for them to remember and so shameful. And I think also what's worth reflecting on is domestic abuse is a crime of power and control. For anyone who's been in an abusive relationship before or knows what it feels like to live in fear of your partner, it's about someone who seeks to have control over almost every element of your life and eventually your life as it is. And what's really scary is that families have already had all the control taken away from them completely. They've lost someone that they loved. And then when the press reinforces the narrative of the perpetrator, seeks to speculate on how he said that she was having an affair, that's why he did it, it was a crime of, jealous passion. Well, none of this is true. It's so harmful to the surviving children, and the long-term effects of that are just, impossible to really summarize.
Megha, can I bring you in here? Because, as a journalist, senior journalist, BBC correspondent, do you recognise that sense that perhaps in newsrooms there's not the knowledge or the understanding, and that perhaps alongside our need to have, punchy headlines tends to perhaps bring about the kind of headline that Janey's referring to there? Or do you think there's something else at work?
I think the former, actually, Diane. And when Janey first got in touch with me, she was sort of much further down the road and much more nuanced when it comes to, when it came to speaking to the families of victims. But I could bring some understanding to her about what, the structure of a newsroom is and what it is to work in, a large corporation as well. So I think a lot of people are under the impression that we all meet for a breakfast meeting and, Tim Davies sitting at the top and then I chime in. That's not how journalism works at all. You have silos, especially, where I work, but also even smaller publications. Not everybody meets every morning. We're not communicating with each other. Just now, I've got a text about an email about a tweet that I put about one issue about domestic violence, which from internally just saying, I've just seen your tweet. Do you mind if I use this for my report? And well, you could have been, we could have actually talked about it before. It didn't have to come from you following my social media. So there's already a disconnect when it comes to communication. There's also this huge kind of lack of understanding. I think we saw it just the other day when it came to Sean Connery's death, which is I posted that he had done an interview in 1965 with Playboy magazine where he said that if a woman was a swear word, then there is, then it justifies to hit her with an open hand. And this was a statement that he made in 1965, but he repeated it in 1987 in an interview with Barbara Walters. And again, 10 years after that as well. And he never publicly apologized for that statement. Now, I posted this interview and I had a lot of journalists, including, colleagues of mine who said, why are you talking about this now? Why he's only been dead we've only known for half an hour that he's died. So it's almost this kind of issue where we can only tell a story a certain way, and there's certain blocks of narratives on how we report about domestic violence, let alone fatal domestic violence. Because we just don't have the nuance on talking about this yet. We do a lot of work on trauma reporting. We've come now to talk about suicide reporting for almost 10 years. I've been a journalist for 10 years, but I remember suicide reporting being spoken about then. But in terms of how we frame the killing of a woman to almost be, listen, one of the worrying things that I had in the early days of before Jamie came in, in the early days before Janey came into the BBC and started speaking to us about it, was people saying, well, you don't want to be led by a lobby group. We're journalists. We have to be independent. And one of the things that, people like Luke and Ryan Hart, whose mother was killed by their father, says is like, we're not asking you to sensationalize or even canonize our families. We just want you to tell the truth, which is, like Janey said, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a whole backstory that doesn't have, and a woman, I was telling Janey, I listened to a podcast about Reva Steenkamp last night, and the psychologist said, we cannot live in a society where a woman is a footnote in her own murder. Families are, want journalists to report on the story, but it's about not speaking in a silo of what the headline is. And I think one example is a story that I'd been following because I remember it happening in real time, which is the murder of Shanann Watts by her husband, Chris Watts. He's what is called a family annihilator. So he killed his wife and his 2 young daughters. And Shanann was lucky enough to have a really, really good friend called Nicole, who came to check in on her in the morning. She'd only been missing for about 3 hours when her friend Nicole came to check in on her and reported it to the police. And the immediate days afterwards, when Chris was not a suspect, I remember a lot of news organizations reporting it about the perfect family and the ideal husband, and these projections, this editorialization that we didn't need to do at that stage. And within about a week, it was really quite clear what had happened to her, and and he confessed to it pretty soon afterwards, and their bodies were found. But in the interim, what Shanann's family reported was that Shanann was not even in the story. And this was a woman who was passionate and sparky. And Diane, you and I have talked about this before, which is, I think as journalists, we know that we don't want people that we interview to be vehicles in our story. They can't be a vehicle for the reporter to get from point A to point B. They have the way that their story is told has to be in a way that you learn the color of a person, whether it's their sense of humor or even their, even their faults. That still adds to the color of somebody. And Shanann had become like the psychologist in the Reva Steenkamp podcast was saying, she'd become a footnote in her own killing, and there's something quite disturbing when that happens. Are we talking
then about something to do with the newsroom culture? Because if we say, look, first of all, there's been evidence around for a long time, and if you're talking about figures earlier, Janey, that must mean that for many people, there's been some lived experience, whether at a distance or in their own families. Are those people not in newsrooms? Where is the absence of any discussion that means that when this story crops up within any newsroom, there'd be some sort of, contradictory voices being heard? Are we talking about a cultural difficulty there?
I can talk about newsroom culture and I'd love Janey to pick up on what she sees, because I think she has a better eye when it comes to reporting from the outset. She always points things out to me, which I think I might have a blind spot to myself, because I'm very much in the middle of the machine. In terms of a newsroom culture, it's part of what Janey said earlier, which is we can become very experienced storytellers, that it becomes quite easy to romanticize a story and pull from all these narratives that we've seen on Netflix, even we've seen these brilliant Danish and Swedish dramas like The Killing and The Bridge. And I remember when Kim Wall was murdered, that people were pulling in, we actually killed the story. We actually decommissioned it, but I saw it on one of the slates saying that it was going to be commissioned, which is this is like a Danish crime drama. A woman's body is found in the sea. And it actually became, culturally, it was because we had gotten so used to how we tell compelling stories and what it is that, and we're in this kind of really odd, we've got this onslaught of information now. In the past, it might have been the newspaper that you see in the morning, but now we're competing against social media. We're competing against Twitter, which in some ways sees itself as your morning newspaper. We're competing against Instagram, podcasts. So newsrooms are feeling under pressure to tell stories, borrowing from the storytelling practices of Netflix. And that's kind of disturbing if you don't have people who are native to understanding what storytelling is on Netflix, but also can apply journalistic practices when it comes to duty of care for somebody and what it means to get a right of reply and what it means to how you're going to frame a story. So when Janey and I had early conversations, which we can I'd love Janey to pick up on. We were thinking, what do we do where we actually granularly, spoon feed newsroom editors so they know? So Janey came up with this page in the guidelines, which is like, here's a how-to. Here's what you don't do in terms of storytelling. And when people saw that, I think it, even now when we spot things, I can just send them that page and say, this is what you don't do. And that's how, that's how I think we slowly begin to shift the newsroom culture.
And Janey, just before you come in, obviously please do pick up on what Megha was saying, but I'm conscious of time. And the one thing I don't want us to avoid doing is to actually talk about what the guidelines are.
Yeah.
For the journalism students who are watching this, we're going to, we'll circulate links and all the rest of it. But to actually hear, well, so what is best practice? I'd like us to make sure we got enough time for that. But please do pick up on what Megha was saying. But if we can come round to then, what is the advice you give? What are the guidelines?
Sure. One thing that I would say as well, just to add on to the conversation around newsroom culture, is the most harmful reporting that families and myself see is actually in the immediate aftermath. This is the breaking news reporting where there's very little information. And I would really encourage journalists at that stage, do you really need to report on it? And if you do, stick to the facts. So even if it's, before a charge or at the point of charge, I can draw on a really good BBC headline here: man charged with murdering wife and daughter in Salisbury. Nothing more to it. That's an absolute fact. You can't contest it. And actually, what was amazing about this article is it said, he's appeared in court. These are the names of the women and the daughter who were murdered. This was her job. This is what people had to say about her. That was it. Nothing further. And what was incredible about that is actually how sad it was that I was so pleased to see something like that, which actually stuck to the facts and respected the victim, because it's just so rare. And a second point I would add is that actually the quality of the reporting that you do increases as the court case goes on. And actually, I would really encourage any news reporter to wait until the point of conviction, because then you can name that it was domestic abuse. You can draw on the evidence that was presented in court. And what you're not doing is either speculating, grasping around, talking to neighbours who don't really know what they're talking about. And families say is one of the most harmful things they see is the neighbour commenting, saying what a lovely man their father was. It's just so inaccurate. And also, most harmfully, you're not going into the court, or you're not taking a Newswire court report from the day of the defence, where the perpetrator is in the dock, spinning all sorts of stories and lies, which get turned into sensationalist headlines. I can put on some here. Husband killed his wife after she mocked the size of his penis. Lesbian fury dad killed daughter. Hubby guilty of murdering his wife over row over her lesbian tryst. And I think a lot of these narratives come directly from the killer. What's terrifying there is I don't think any journalist would want to be a spokesperson for a murderer, but in fact that's what happens. And the woman's truth and the woman's story is completely overlooked, and she's not here anymore to argue her case. So what I would say to follow on from that is there are several points in the guidelines, and the first one is to hold the killer accountable, place responsibility on them through accountability. So refrain from describing the murder as an uncharacteristic event. You have to look deeper into the character of the relationship. And if that's not available, then don't do it. Because 49% of women are killed within 1 month of separation. 90% are killed within a year of separation. You have to ask what was going on in that relationship for the separation to become fatal. And it's your duty as a journalist in a democracy to look into that and represent the facts. Also, you're providing a huge service to the family who want the story out there. And to extend on the point of accountability, just avoid using any speculation or reasons or triggers for a man murdering a partner or ex-partner. Don't use this typical framework of, man kills partner after her actions. We've all seen it. We've seen so many of them. Don't call the man a jilted lover. Don't frame it in the context of an affair. Anyone who's been in an abusive relationship will tell you that the perpetrator is obsessed with the concept of cheating or having an affair, and they're terribly, terribly jealous people. And that extends beyond the death of the partner to justify her death, because, in his eyes, that's justifiable. And also, I think something that Megha and I talked about, and I'm aware this is a very grey area and a sticky area in terms of court reporting, because there's so few resources for court reporting now. But please consider the sources that you're using on your piece, and don't build a piece solely from a defendant's claims in court. That's so irresponsible, especially pre-conviction. Don't just, take verbatim what they've said and what their defence barrister has said and then say the case continues. That's the worst journalism I have seen, because there's no one there to contest it. There's no one there to verify the truth of what he's saying. And really, it's so damaging for the families. It's so damaging.
I think one of the difficulties that might present itself, and I'm thinking about the young journalism students who, as I say, this is aimed at, they are likely to not have a say about whether they do or don't, report, and to come back from a court case and say, I've got nothing. There's nothing to add here. That's going to be very difficult for them to argue as a junior person in a newsroom. Has this steer not got to come from above? That sense of within the newsroom, the culture is such that this is what we expect you to do. And I wonder, given that two of the media regulators, but not all the regulators, have picked up on this, whether there's a plan to approach Ofcom, how far that's gone, in which case, because it does seem to me that if it's absolutely right to lay it on every journalist, but we also know that in terms of newsroom culture, it's not a level playing field. The newest person in, who might well have come through the training with this guidance, is unlikely to be able to win the day in an argument in a newsroom. Are there any plans for it to come, to be adopted by Ofcom, for it to be, by all the regulators, so that it's something agreed across the board?
Ideally, yes. I haven't approached Ofcom, because what I've been doing is speaking with IPSO and working with IPSO and running newsroom trainings. I've run several newsroom trainings across the political spectrum and across the print spectrum. And actually, I have seen impacts from that. And I think something that journalists do seem quite grateful for is just an understanding of what fatal domestic abuse is, because what we're looking at here is actually an incredibly nuanced and complex subject area that no one's really a specialist in until you sit down and learn about it. I agree with you. It needs to come from the top. Something that we're arguing for at the moment with a collective of families is for an amendment to the editor's code under clause 4, intrusion into grief or shock, because we do see that being the most problematic area, where a family is in the immediate trauma and the aftermath of a domestic homicide. And not only does the journalist behaviour, doorstepping, ringing, speaking to neighbours, not only does that intrude into their grief or shock, but the articles themselves do, when someone is, absolutely overwhelmed, and then they just see a report in the paper which is completely dismissive and undignified about the mother that they've just lost.
Megha, do you feel that, have you seen a change in that culture within newsrooms that you've worked in? I mean, do we see that there is, some sort of way in which it's coming from the top, or is it still, do you think, an argument that's needing to be made?
It's one of those things where I think specialist reporters are leading the way and kind of getting in touch individually with editors. And Janey's guidelines are so great, because we've actually got something that we can circulate now and say, this doesn't fit into this style. So it's not, the onus is not on the junior reporter to because we've all been in that situation where we've said something and been shut down because either lack of experience or perceived lack of experience, or being on insecure contracts, which I have a lot to say about in another time and space. But I am seeing changes that are coming inside the corporation that I work in. That people are listening. The guidelines definitely help. Janey's had some, Janey's done some workshops with us. We have a body inside the BBC called Global Women in News, GWIN. And whenever there's an issue that I think is something that needs to be BBC-wide, that the most senior women in news are in that body. So I'll make sure that we do some sort of a panel within GWIN, and there are other bodies as well. So people like, Second Source, where the organisation that I've set up, as well as Women in Journalism, we offer lots of mentorship schemes. So if there is a junior journalist who is looking for an ally to navigate that awkward conversation with an editor about being made to tell position a story in a certain way, we have access to almost every single working news body. And even a tweet that I did last week about that Janey and I were talking about Manchester News Network, where they said, a woman's been caught having sex on a train platform. And this was a woman who was on medication. She doesn't remember what happened, which, Janey pointed out, we don't even know if this was consensual. And she had been running away from a domestic abuse situation. So the pressure from that meant that they've, re-amended that article, which came from a lot of journalists, the body of journalists kind of talking about it. So I want young reporters to know that they're not in a silo anymore. It's not how it used to be. There are enough people, willing to troubleshake, shake that tree a little bit.
Yes, excellent. We'll share the link to where they can see the guidelines. There's 5 basic guidelines. It's not actually that hard to find the information, and you've made it very clear, I think, in the way you've laid that out. And what you're suggesting, Megha, as well, you make sure that if you are needing to challenge, that you get some support before you do that, so that you don't feel exposed, or that makes it difficult for you to do so. It's still with us, but it would be great if we don't have this conversation again in a year's time. But thank you both very much.
Thank you for having this.
Thank you, Diane.